we're now going to take a look at customizing the atmosphere. I've gone ahead and created a scene that you can load in. It's included with the training, and it's just called Infinite Terrain. So you can go ahead and load that in. What we have in the scene is a variation on the brown strata infinite terrain. The sea level, which I do have set at 0 for the Z. And this, if we go to File and Options, we can see is a spherical scene, where the scene radius is 6,400 kilometers, and the view unit is set to 1 meter. Now, one thing I want to note is whenever you're using a spherical or planetary scene, if we go to the Atmosphere Editor, which you can access with F4 on the keyboard, or go up to Atmosphere Editor. If you're in the standalone version, if you're using Extreme, the integrated version, you'll of course need to select the Atmosphere Editor icon, which looks like a little sun behind clouds, or you can use the pull-down menu for the Extreme plugin. Now what we're going to see are a couple of changes when working with a spherical or spherical scene, whether it's a planetary terrain or not, and that is that the aerial perspective under global settings is null. This setting is now adjusted by the unit. If we go to File and Options, Units and Coordinates, the one view unit is 1 meter. Now if we change this setting, it will adjust to the aerial perspective of the scene. So those are the two are directly related to each other. Also, it is somewhat dependent on the scene radius. Another thing you'll notice is the atmospheric model, the volumetric and standard models are grayed out, and that we have environment mapping, which is the ability to place an image in the background, an environment map, or the spectral model. We're going to start by taking a look at adjusting the sun and the sunlight. There's a couple of different ways we can do this. If we go over to the numerics tab in the upper right, we can switch to the rotation or the orientation tab, which is the second one down, and you can adjust the yaw, pitch, and roll of the sun to modify the position that way. Or if we go to the Sun tab within the Atmosphere Editor, we can adjust the azimuth, which is the rotation of the sun around the scene. And then the pitch is the rising and setting of the sun. So with the pitch set to 0, the sun is on the horizon. And then at 90, it's directly all the way up at the top of the sky. We can also go the other way around so that we can have it on the bottom. Now I'm clicking on the render preview to have it update, and sometimes it will not update after you make a change to the atmosphere. If you notice that it's not updating, what you can do is sometimes just click, just a really quick click on one of the commands, and then what will happen is it'll refresh and allow you to render. Just clicking quick enough so that it doesn't make any changes to the actual camera. Sometimes it's a good idea just to save the camera with the little store camera icon. And this is only available, of course, if you're using the standalone version, so Infinite or Extreme Standalone. And one setting that is available directly only within the standalone or infinite version, when you have that open, is the ability to adjust the sunlight by moving it in the viewport with the point at camera option in order to place the position directly where you want it. If we switch to the rotation gizmo in the other viewports, if we rotate it, it will update. So you can change it that way. If we turn on point at camera, I did reset my position a little. But what we can do in the main viewport now is if we switch to the view mode, if you take a look where the gizmos are at, we have parent, local, global, and view coordinate. So the view coordinate is based on the camera. So if we select our sun, we can move it around and place it where we want it. And it's going to automatically adjust the rotation settings to match the position that we're giving it. And that's with the point at camera mode turned on, which can be checked on and off in the aspect tab. So if you're working in Extreme plugin, go to Object Properties and make sure this is turned off because adjusting the camera can move the position of the sun and sometimes change where you have the sun appearing. It doesn't always happen, but sometimes if you move the camera, it will move the sun around. So if you are in the Extreme plugin, I just suggest keeping that off because it really doesn't have any impact, and that can be accessed from the Object Properties command. So if we go back to the Atmosphere Editor, and we take a look at some of the other options within the sun. Of course, we can adjust the size of the sun with the size of the sun slider, so we can make a very small sun or a very large sun that appears in the scene. And then we can also adjust the corona, which is that glow around the edge of the sun. And now the impact of these settings and these two sliders are really going to be heavily modified by the glow intensity and the scattering, the overall scattering, and not so much by the cloud scattering. So if those settings are set too high, having the corona really large, it's going to kind of wash everything out. So go ahead and set that to 30%. And the size of the sun we'll set to, actually we'll go ahead and do 1.5%. It will round off to 2, but it is set to 1.5, which we can see once we click on it. But once we click off, we see the rounded value. Now here is another option, which is to attach the sun to the camera's direction. This is one of those settings, or the one that really controls whether or not the sun moves with the camera. So make sure if you're using Extreme, unless you want a fixed position on the sun, to stay in that point in the viewport or where the camera is oriented, then you want to leave it on, but otherwise keep it checked off. If we turn it on right now and now move the camera, we can see that the sun is going to stay approximately in the same direction. It does look like the pitch isn't really modified, just the azimuth and orientation. I'll go ahead and turn that off. So now let's take a look at the actual light produced from the sun and the balance of lighting within the scene. The sunlight color, if we take a look in the aspect tab with the sun selected, right click edit color, it is set to white with 255 all the way on the RGB, or the lume value set to 255 and hue and saturation values at 0. We can modify the color of the sun. You'll want to use very small changes in order to get a color without completely washing everything out. So if we wanted, let's see, a red look to the sun, what we can do is just modify this with the RGB value and type in 254 for the green and the blue, and then have the red set to 255. And we'll notice a very slight hint of red bring it down to 250, but leaving the red value at 255. These are very small changes that just give a little tint. If we bring it down to 200 for the green and the blue, we'll notice a little more intense. It looks like it did not update that color setting. Okay, so with it set to 250, or sorry, 200 for the green and the blue, 255 for the red, we can see much more of a pink look to the scene. It does look like I'll need to close that out. I'm going to bring that back to 250, click OK. And just something very subtle now. So small changes can make a big difference. You'll see it more if you have a higher amount of glow within the scene, but you can just directly change the color that way, although the atmosphere itself and the settings for that will also modify the look of the lighting and the color automatically because it is shining through volumetric. If we go to the Light tab, then we have a lot more control over the sunlight. So if we look in the lighting model, the most typically used is the global ambience mode. It's going to give you the quickest render while still using the ambient light from the scene in order to light it. The standard model in most cases is a little too light, as we can see for the ambient, at least with those settings at 50%, which is a balance between sunlight or shadows and the ambient lighting. So it's basically, in this case, because our shadows for the sunlight are at 100%, the light balance will modify the shadow intensity. So right now at 50%, it's at 50% darkness. If you set it to 100%, then we're going to see black shadows. If we set it to 0, we're going to see no shadows at all. And as you can see, it's not updating, so I'm going to click on the focal really quick, and then it'll update. So now we have 100% ambient lighting. And then we can adjust where the ambient lighting is coming from. So if we set it to the sky, or a uniform, which will call upon the color, or the ambient light color, and that's our balance there. Let's go ahead and set that back to 50, and light balance back to 50. Now when we use the global ambience mode, it's going to use the sky's color in order to modify the ambient lighting in the scene, giving it a tint and balance that way. The sky dome lighting gain that we can see here, right now this is set to -0.1, so it's darkening the ambient light from the sky. If we go ahead and bring it up to a value of 1, and I'm going to go ahead and make that preview render a little bigger. Set my preview quality to fast. So now we see much brighter ambient areas. The shadows are much lighter. So that can be done with sky dome lighting gain, which is going to increase the sky color influence on ambient light. Or just really the overall scene, not just ambient areas, just that intensity of the lighting. If we set it to -1, it's going to darken quite a bit. There's almost no ambient light. Let's set that to 0 for now. So if we take a look in the aspect tab, this kind of light and the sunlight does not have an intensity setting. It's controlled by the light intensity within the atmosphere editor. So if we want to make the sunlight brighter, we need to use the option within the light intensity to make that sunlight brighter. You can also see that it's not just modifying or changing just the diffuse lighting or the areas that are not in shadow. It is going to affect the entire scene. Since the intensity of the light is growing, or getting larger in this case, much brighter, it's lighting the sky as well, the atmosphere, and because we have global ambience turned on, the ambient light generated from the sky is brighter. So everything becomes much lighter. You could increase that value to a very high amount if you need a lot of light, and then compensate. If we go to the main camera, I'm going to turn on auto exposure, which should adjust our exposure settings based on that amount of light. So you can see once it renders that first pass from the preview, it starts to update and now shows something that isn't as overexposed. So in this case, what we have is the sky balancing out a little more with the terrain very bright. So that's a good way to balance out the difference between the sky and the ground, because typically the sky is almost always brighter during the day. And when we're trying to render out atmospheres and scenes, we want a nice balance between those. Something that's realistic isn't always going to look the best, because the sky would more than likely be exposed a lot higher than the rest of the scene. So this gives you a good way to really customize that. We can also darken it, the light intensity, and that gives a nice balance overall between the sky and the different lighting amounts. And then going into the main camera, we can customize the exposure level based on that, whether or not we want to use the natural film response, and then adjusting gamma to pick up on the amount of light that we need. I'm still sticking with just a 1.4 for my gamma. I'm going to go back and bring the light intensity to 0. And at first, the render preview will be very bright because it's using the auto exposure from before, but then it'll refresh after the first pass, once it gets an evaluation of it. And one of the last modifiers for the light intensity, of course, a lot of things are really dependent on other settings overall. So basically, if we had our decay level set really high, the sun itself wouldn't be as bright. So some things are dependent. But for the most part, if we want to increase what we have is the glow intensity, down here in the bottom, we can spread the light out throughout the scene, or just increase that overall glow amount that we're seeing within the atmospherics, in the haze and the fog. Now, the amount that spreads out throughout the scene, or around the scene, I should really say, is just by the scattering. And then there's a specific, or a separate one for scattering light throughout clouds. Now, with it set to 0, it's going to be a pretty even amount around the horizon, very bright. If you have the glow intensity set really to anything, it'll be pretty bright and spread throughout. It also affects, like I said, the ambient lighting and just the overall glow throughout the scene. And since the ambient light is lighting the scene, we'll see the diffuse levels change around the edges of objects. So this spreads out the light to more of an overcast type light, all the way to, if we set the scattering to 1, basically if it's at 1, the glow intensity is null. It won't really modify much of anything, except maybe a tiny bit around the sun, but it doesn't look like it's really doing anything. It looks like it really only adjusts the size of the sun. So if the scattering is set to 1, there's basically no scattering of light throughout the atmosphere. Like I said, the only thing it really changes is the size of the sun or the amount of glow around the corona. And if the corona is set to 0, it probably will have no effect whatsoever. So now changing it to, say, 0.99, and then increasing the glow intensity, we're going to see the corona area brighten up more. If we get rid of the corona, we might just need to adjust the size of the sun to change that. But it looks like that's not really having that big of an impact. So with the glow intensity at 100%, bringing this down to, say, 0.92, very large glow. So you just want to kind of balance out your glow intensity with the scattering. Looks like 165 is the default. Depending on the focal length of the camera, which mine's currently set to 13 millimeters, I wouldn't need as high of a value in order to get a good contrast balance between where the sun's at and the rest of the scene. But if you have a tighter focal or even a wider one, and you want to see more of a brighter area around the sun and darker areas on the rest of the scene, you can bring it up to, if I bring it up to 182, we can see a nice fall off. And really just kind of got to adjust that glow intensity and then the corona size, maybe down to 15. Let's go ahead and bring the sun size to 1, and that'll balance out a little bit better. And of course, like I said, a lot of this is really dependent on other areas of lighting, especially the decay amounts and fog. So next we're going to take a look at those settings. And then start modifying colors and really kind of setting up more customized atmospheres. And I just want to make one more note about ambient lighting before moving on to the rest of the atmosphere and making additional changes. If we take a look in the light tab, the ambient light color, also the overall skylight color, big impact on the balance of ambient lighting in the scene and what we're seeing in the sky, regardless of whether or not the to sky and clouds option is turned on. The ambient light around the horizon is really dependent on the overall sky color and the ambient light color. If I was to change the ambient light color to almost black, and I'm going to go ahead and just take this color and drag it over here into my color selection favorites, just so I can go back to it. Click OK. What we're going to see is a much darker sky around the horizon. And that's going to modify clouds as well, which we'll see once we start adding clouds into the scene. Clouds are typically really bright overall, and if you need to darken them, sometimes editing the ambient light color is really the only way to do that. Now, if we want to switch the ambient light color back, we could go back to the color chooser, or we can right-click and reset the color, which will bring it back. Same thing with the overall sky color. This is automatically adjusted based on the settings in the Sky, Fog, and Haze tab. So modifying those settings will change the overall sky color. We can also edit it, make it more orange. Now we can see the impact on the scene, not so much on clouds or the sky, because we don't really have any clouds in there right now. But we can right-click and reset the color, and then it'll go back to that approximated color or the evaluated color that it came up with before.